Summer reading list. So every summer I load up on books. This summer I chose 8 books that I'm reading simultaneously. I don't plan to finish all of them by the end of the summer, especially considering the fact that basically have a month left in summer. But I like to read a lot of different kinds of books. I like variety, so I decided this summer, all right, let me just pick a whole bunch of different kinds of books, different genres, different authors, different topics. And when it's time for me to read, I'll just pick kind of whichever one I'm in the mood for. And I thought I'd just do a little video just kind of telling you what I'm reading right now. So the first book I want to talk about is called The Life of Saint Teresa of Avila, a Biography. This book is by Carlos Eyre. She was a 16th century nun living in Avila, which is a small city in Spain. I know her work because a while back I started and recently finished her book called The Interior Castle. Although I grew up very conservative and Christian, in the past few years I've been getting more interested in kind of like esoteric or mystical experiences and theologies and understandings of religion. And St. Teresa has been a bit of a hero of mine. She is famous because just kind of one day out of the blue, she started experiencing what she said were these incredible visions from God. And she had scores, maybe hundreds of these throughout her life, and wrote many of them down and documented them, and ended up getting in trouble with the Spanish Inquisition because at the time the Spanish Inquisition was basically routing out everyone who didn't believe what the people in charge believed, in some cases punishing or even executing people. Jewish people living in Spain, people living with alternative beliefs who were kind of branded as heretics. And she basically was instructed by the inquisitors to kind of write a defense of her spiritual experiences. And this defense became a book called The Life of Saint Teresa of Avila. Although it was kind of kept under lock and key by the Catholic Church for a while, eventually it got into the wider public. It's considered like one of the kind of classics in kind of Western esoteric spirituality. For example, I don't know if you can see this on the front cover, but her most famous vision that she experienced involved a manifestation of an angel piercing her heart with like a spear for multiple days on end. And according to her, it was both the most rapturous and beautiful and amazing, but also most painful experience of her life because it gave her this like direct connection with God. In the tradition I grew up, this is complete nonsense, this is heresy, but other people witnessed her having these. When she would have these experiences, she would just kind of like stare up into the sky and shake or sweat or whatever. And just all throughout her life, she has experiences, and it is considered one of the most important and influential kind of Christian mystics of all time. So this book, interestingly enough, is not about her; it's about the book. It's a book about how her autobiography came to be written. And kind of the aftermath of it, and both it's in terms of it's kind of like first kind of political suppression from the Catholic Church, but eventually it becoming a major kind of milestone in kind of Christian and Catholic mysticism. So far it's really fantastic. I'm really enjoying it, and yeah, Saint Teresa, big fan. The next book I'm reading is called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Not a very exciting cover, but a fantastic book. If you know Aldous Huxley, it's probably because of this book, Brave New World. This is his most famous novel. It was written in the 1930s. I'm sure a lot of people know George Orwell's 1984. This is a book, it's a pretty similar themed book, but it came out about 2 decades before Orwell's 1984. I have not read this book. I can't say much about it, but this is the only reason I know Aldous Huxley's name, because this is important. I did not realize that in addition to writing kind of like the most kind of influential kind of dystopian novels in the kind of the English language, he was also really into like kind of alternative spiritualities. He was really influenced by Buddhism, by Hinduism, by Christian mysticism, Catholic mysticism, and Taoism in particular. He had a pretty good grasp of these various traditions. And in The Perennial Philosophy, he does something that a lot of people have done before and since, which is try to synthesize the different beliefs of these different traditions and really focus on the things that kind of bring them together, right? So in this book, he's not saying all religions are the same. All religions are not the same. What he's saying is that inside of each religion, there are certain traditions, right? So I grew up Christian. There are traditions that are more intellectual, traditions that are more charismatic. Within every religion, there are more kind of like mystical traditions, like traditions in which, like Teresa of Avila, people are trying to connect with God directly. Basically argues, if you look at the mystics within those traditions, they all kind of say the same thing. And he argues that there is a perennial philosophy. In other words, there are certain spiritual beliefs that show up in every world religion at some point. Let me just give you a few examples. The belief that there's kind of one source for everything. Even in like polytheistic religions like Hinduism, for the most part, there are traditions within these faiths that teach, no, there's kind of one source for everything. Another example of what he calls a perennial philosophy is the idea that love is the most important virtue, that love is kind of the thing that conquers everything else. And he also focuses on just kind of like everyday spiritual kind of beliefs about oneself. For example, the idea of like ego death in Christianity is sometimes called mortification, which means dying to oneself. The idea that in order to progress spiritually, one has to kind of almost sacrifice one's ego, one's wants, one's desires to a kind of higher and greater good. So it's a really fascinating book. It was written in the 1940s, so some of his like language and ideas is a little colonialist, especially when he talks about Native American religions, for example, or indigenous Australian religions or whatever, and some of that's a little cringy, but it's a really, really fascinating read, and it really starts speaking to where I am right now, because I'm in this place where I'm still kind of like taking apart the aspects of Christianity that I was raised that I think are bad, and kind of keeping the parts that are good. This book is really kind of helping me do that, so fantastic read. The next book is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, by Rashid Khalidi. This is basically a book about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, starting in 1917, but it's written from a Palestinian perspective. Most historical accounts of the history of Israel going from being a tiny minority in mostly Arab Palestine to basically kind of being in charge of that region of the world is a story that's been told by a lot of people, but it's typically told from a kind of pro-Jewish, or one might say kind of like pro-Zionist perspective. Obviously, for the past few years, this has been a huge issue in American politics, right? Because we tend to support Israel, especially now, given who's in charge of things. And that has led to a lot of pushback and anger and activism. Even amongst a lot of activists, there's a pretty broad ignorance about the actual history of that. So this book is filling in a lot of blanks, and boy, is it eye-opening. The plight of the Palestinian peoples is absolutely one of the most devastating and sad cases of just utter displacement and destruction and violence I have ever heard of. And this book, it's a difficult read. Sometimes it's page after page after page of like, and then this military conflict happened and this many people died and Israel took this much land. It's a really, really, really tragic story. And while this book is not unbiased, I mean, obviously it's written from a Palestinian perspective, it is very factual. The author backs up everything he says with facts and data and sources. And yes, while some of the interpretation might be biased, there are times where the numbers just speak for themselves. And I'm learning so much from it. A lot of the things that people have accused the nation of Israel of, like saying they're going to do one thing publicly and doing something completely different, kind of disproportionate retaliation, right? So some Palestinian group or group of people or whatever does something to Israel, and Israel responds with violence that is like many, many, many times more than the initial incident. Just taking land and just saying like, well, this is our land, too bad, and pushing people out. That goes back all the way back to the 1917 war, which was kind of the beginning of a lot of this. But the book also traces that the ideas of Zionism go back many, many, many decades before that. So it's an enlightening read, it's an infuriating read, and is, for me, filling in a lot of holes, historical holes about kind of what's happening right now. I mean, just a few days ago, there was a news story that kind of got buried because we're all worried about Trump and Iran now. But there's no news story about, basically Israeli settlers encroaching into land that wasn't theirs and taking it and killing people, and the Israeli government saying it's okay that we do this and coming and backing them up. So it's infuriating again, but it's a really, really good read. So with all the very kind of like intense and serious books I've been reading, I had to throw in a few that were kind of lighthearted, and one of those is a book called Please Kill Me, An Uncensored History of Punk Rock, by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain. You can see this little gold thing. This is the 20th anniversary edition. I actually read this book about 20 years ago, but I was writing a paper on the philosophy of punk rock. And this book was one of my kind of primary sources. So for those who don't know, the punk movement starts in New York City kind of in the late 60s, early 1970s. And it never fully crosses over to the mainstream in the United States, really until the 90s with bands like Nirvana. And this is a really unique book because it focuses mostly on New York City, a little bit on Detroit as well. There's a guy, some of you might know him, Iggy Pop, with a band called the Stooges that come out of Detroit, so they focus on him as well because he played in New York and was really influential in the punk scene. And just kind of how it started out as these weird, arty bands playing in the Lower East Side of New York City, which now is very expensive and elite. At the time was super abandoned and broken down, and it was drug and sex work haven. And these mostly suburban kids started moving back into the city in these areas that nobody wanted to live in, and formed this genre of music called punk. Is one of the most important influential American music genres of the second half of the 20th century. It's a unique book because it's an oral history. In other words, the authors themselves don't say anything. The whole thing is just there'll be a chapter with like a topic kind of covering a particular region of time or a scene or a band or something, and they just interviewed people, and the people go through and they just share stories. So it really is just like kind of direct, from the horse's mouth, the people who were there, who saw this happen, who helped it unfold, kind of talking about it. I will say, like, even though it's a fun read, it's pretty dark. I mean, drugs, a lot of sexism too, right? Then as now, kind of harder forms of rock music tend to be male dominated. This is way before, like, kind of like these underground communities really wrestled with things like sexism and treating women as sexual objects. But despite all that, like, these people were so funny and so creative, and it's just inspiring to learn about people who just kind of came together one day and said, hey, let's do this thing, let's make this new community. And I think despite the ickiness, I think we're all better off because of this music and this scene. The next book is called Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World by Tyson Yunkaporta. Tyson Yunkaporta is an academic who teaches in Queensland, Australia, and he teaches and does research about kind of indigenous Australian cultures. He himself also is a member of an indigenous tribe, and basically this book is about at some point in his adult life, he decided to reconnect with his cultural roots, and is just kind of sharing like the wisdom that he learned from the stories and the traditions of his people. In this book, he's arguing something that I'm actually have been saying, and maybe not on social media, I'm going to be saying more, is that a lot of us today, we look around the world and we're not very hopeful about the future of the human race. It just seems like, free market capitalism and development and taking resources and destroying the environment is just a foregone conclusion, and there's kind of nothing we can do about it. And in this book, he kind of tries to kind of argue like, well, maybe one of the ways to go forward is to kind of go back to these ancient traditions, these older ideas that sustain people for thousands and thousands and thousands of years through things like oral traditions and storytelling and symbolic pieces of art. And he's kind of showing how he's doing that, but also showing how ancient traditions can say a lot about things like sustainability, about how to live together, about how to create more just and fair societies. This is a conclusion I came to about even my own tradition. I've been getting really back into kind of like older biblical wisdom traditions and even Greco-Roman traditions. And of course, there's lots of bad stuff in there, but if you can filter out the bad stuff, there's a lot of stuff that we modern people desperately need to hear and embrace and kind of return to. And that's what he's kind of arguing. So I'm not very far into the book. I think I'm only like chapter 2. But so far, this has been a great read. And I also appreciate the fact that he's an academic and he just writes in a very accessible way, because I am one of those people who thinks that even though I was kind of trained in academia, I think academia mostly sucks. So my next book is Tarot for the Hard Work. It's got a long subtitle. An Archetypical Journey to Confront Racism and Inspire Collective Healing by Maria Minnis. As some of you who know me personally know, I've gotten really interested in tarot traditions. Now, I know for people who I grew up with, people who are kind of more maybe Christian or even especially conservative Christians, in terms of how I was brought up, when I heard the word tarot, I was like, that's evil, that's satanic, it's demonic, it's playing with spirits.
Could it be Satan?
None of that is true. Let me just say, like, I don't use it to predict the future. I think that's stupid. I don't use it to kind of divine what's going to happen in world events. For me, and I think for most contemporary people who do the tarot, it's more of a spiritual exercise for self-reflection, for kind of looking into yourself and saying, kind of like, what's going on inside of me, and how can these really interesting symbolic images in these cards help me think about things like wisdom, things like love, things like achieving kind of inner equilibrium and peace and whatnot. And basically in this book, Maria Minnis takes the tarot tradition, particularly what's called the Major Arcana, which are these 22 cards in the tarot that have really, really strong symbolic meaning. Cards like death, right, which obviously represents death and all the symbolic meanings that go with death. It's probably one of the most famous cards from that. The Fool, right, is another card which represents beginnings. And she basically takes these cards, gives an interesting spin on their traditional interpretations, and applies them to kind of like social justice work. I didn't realize this book was like a workbook. I'm not really a workbook person, so I'm kind of skipping over the workbook parts. But still, it's really interesting hearing kind of her perspective, especially as like a black woman, on this tradition, which historically kind of descends from medieval Europe and has mostly been kind of like Anglo tradition for a long time. So I think it's really cool when people discover other cultures' traditions and kind of like find these new and different nuances and meanings in them. So this has been a really good read as well. The next book has a very provocative title, Matter and Desire in Erotic Ecology by Andreas Weber. When I heard the word erotic, I think of sex, adult content, whatever. He doesn't necessarily mean it in that way. He's using the word erotic more in its kind of original understanding of like kind of related to the Greek god Eros. So Eros was the Greek god of love. Some of us might know him as Cupid, his kind of Roman form, right? Because the Romans took over a lot of the Greek gods and gave them different names. And in kind of like Greco-Roman, especially Greek mythology, Eros was not just the god of sex. Eros was the god of love, of romance, of intimacy, of touch. When this author says erotic, he's saying in that more kind of holistic sense. And I am not very far in this book, but I am already absolutely captivated. I literally just read the introduction. Now you can see how many pages I already dog-eared. Basically, his idea is that eroticism, again, meaning kind of love, connection, touch, intimacy, that eroticism is one of the fundamental kind of structures or powers or forces in the universe. That if you're even talking about things like cellular level stuff, bacteria, trees, plants, that all of biological life, right, is kind of interconnected and interwebbed in this kind of endlessly erotic web. It's kind of a complex argument, so I'm just going to read a little passage. Okay, this is from the introduction. The search for love is a central movement that characterizes life, and it remains as inexhaustible as it is unfulfilled. Its consistent failure, meaning kind of in the human realm, right, could mean that we understand love as little as we understand the living world. We often love incorrectly. This is the starting hypothesis of this book. In private and in politics, in big ways and in little ones, in our culture and in our beds, we love incorrectly because what we consider love does not enliven us, nor does it enliven the world. I'm going to jump down a little bit and read one more sentence. Anyone who dismisses love cannot understand reality. So again, he's arguing that it's not just like love is just like this good feeling or this thing that kind of unites us or keeps us from killing each other. He actually argues that, no, love actually explains and describes the fundamental, like, biological, chemical, molecular structure of the world, right? That interconnectedness, interconnectivity, dependence, interdependence, right? That all of these things are so important to biology, and they should be important to us. Another really important book for I think our moment right now, when there are dominant forces in our society and all over the world who are trying to say no, destruction, devastation, theft, taking from other people and marginalizing those people. That's what it means to be human, right? Especially in America, that is a very dominant idea right now. And I just find it so beautiful and refreshing to encounter this kind of work, which is, you know, it's complex, it's thoughtful, it's beautifully written, almost like a mixture of like poetry and scientific writing. And I'm just really enjoying this book, and again, highly recommend it. And last but not least, I have another biography. This one is called Room to Dream. This is written by David Lynch and Kristen McKenna. So for those of you who don't know David Lynch, he is one of my heroes. He is most famously responsible for a TV show called Twin Peaks, which is considered one of the most kind of influential television shows of all time. He was a very experimental film director, probably most famous for movies like Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, and Mulholland Drive, which was his only film to really kind of like get a lot of mainstream attention. So David Lynch is one of America's most wonderful creative oddballs. He is just known for being really strange and unique and making really strange and unique films. Of course, since he's such a unique person, we need a unique book about him. So this book is not like any biography I've ever read. It's actually a biography-autobiography hybrid. So the way the book is set out is like, first you'll have a chunk of his life, and at first you'll have a chapter from Christine McKenna. She's the kind of like about the facts person, right? She's the one who interviewed people. She's the one who did archival research. She's the one who put kind of all the facts together and say, okay, here's what happened, and here's the order in which they happened. And then immediately after that chapter, you have a companion chapter, a follow-up chapter, written by David Lynch himself, in which he just kind of like reminisces. Like he'll tell these really interesting stories that sometimes are almost like beside the point, but he's a really fun storyteller. You know, if you know his work, you know that one of his signature things is like really, really, really weird characters. Like all of his characters are weird and strange and a little off. And in his life, it seems like he was really attracted to people like that. Like he kind of like just noticed weird people, and would writes paragraph after paragraph sometimes of like this weird guy at like a diner or something like that, right? That he saw one time. But also really lots of great stories about his filmmaking, about kind of his struggles, his highs and his lows throughout his life, and also just the really unique and weird way he viewed the world. I am currently rewatching Twin Peaks for the third time, and it's just been really interesting. It's made me want to go back and watch all of his films, which I'll probably have to do now. So another great book. That is my summer reading list. I hope you enjoyed it. If you read any of these books, let me know. If you decide you want to pick one of these books up and you start reading it, comment down below as well. We'll have a little conversation about it. So thank you all for watching.